Hi everybody. Good afternoon. Dobry din. Trying my Russian. Okay. So good afternoon everybody. So thank you for attending this book presentation. And my name is April. I'm a reference librarian and the subject librarian for SSH. And I will be your moderator for today's event. So this event is organized by the NU Library in partnership with the Department of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies of SSH. So for today's event, we are highlighting a book recently published by one of our local professors, Dr. Daniel Scarborough. This new book is entitled Russia's Social Gospel, the Orthodox Pastoral Movement in Famine and Revolution, published by the University of Wisconsin Press last June. So to formally start this event, may we invite Professor Siegfried van Doffel, Department Chair, Department of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies, School of Sciences, and the Humanities to give the opening remarks. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Hello, everyone. Yeah, when I first heard that I had to give an opening speech to Dan's book, I panicked because I wasn't sure whether I would have anything useful to say about his book. But so let me first say I will just say a few things. First of all, I think the fact that we have another book presentation of one of our colleagues is kind of a reason to celebrate for the department as well. I think it not only shows that we have been able to attract really good scholars to the department, both in philosophy and in history, but also it shows that we have been able to, well, facilitate the kind of work that they need to do. And I think this is in part because we have been, at least in part, because we have been able to allow people to take research leaves, people who have been teaching overloads and then have been able to take a semester off semesters that would accommodate their research, allowing them to go to archives, for example, in the case of historians. And I think that that's something that I think has been achieved by the school, the previous school, SHSS, but now the current school. But I also think that this is something that in our department we've been able to successfully continue. So I think it's really important that the university acknowledges that this is something that is incredibly beneficial to the university, that scholars are able to sometimes take some time off from teaching so that they can focus fully on their research. And we've been able to do that, for example, by allowing people to teach overloads, more courses than they are strictly required to do, so that they can then, after they've taught 2 overloads, take a semester off. So that's one thing. The second thing is, yeah, we still publish books in history and in the humanities in general. In some other fields, this may sound weird. Why would you even bother to publish books? But in history, this is actually taken as a paradigm of scholarship. There are actually some historians who have flourishing careers without ever publishing a book, but they are far and few between. For most historians, the first landmark of their scholarly activity is actually the publication of their first book. And so in this case, for Dan, well done. It's a book published with a very good press. I mean, not everybody will think of the University of Wisconsin press as similar in luster as say Oxford or Cambridge University, but in Dan's field, this is actually one of the major presses to publish with. So again, this is something that, I mean, shows that we have been able to attract really good scholars. Last thing, I will say very few things about the book itself, because it's Dan will be able to do that much better than me. But it's a book on first of all on social dynamics in the sense of a church that is responding, as an institution that is responding to grassroots movements to accommodate or to help people in need, I should say. And the impact that that has on the institution of the church, but then also it links those descriptions to wider, more highbrow thesis about, for example, secularization. So at some point in European history or historiography, there was a very strong tendency to think of religion as on the retreat, and this was sometimes described as secularization, although Dan will also tell you that there are very, very different understandings of what secularization is. But anyway, so on the one hand, this is a book about what is happening on the ground, grassroots movements, and then it's a book about the institution of the church, or the Orthodox Church at least, how it responds and how it is transformed by those grassroots movements. And then it's also and links this with more broader historical discussions among historians about the role of religion and the role of the church in contemporary societies. So as you can imagine, that is a complex book, not something that you can summarize in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, not even something that you can publish as an article of 20 or 25 pages. And that's one of the reasons why historians write books. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Dan.
Thank you, Siegfried. Thank you very much, April, and everyone in the library for organizing this event. Thank you very much, colleagues and students, for coming to listen to my presentation here. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank my colleagues in particular who have given me their comments and their feedback and their encouragement over the course of this project. It's been very valuable. And most of all, I want to thank my wife, Alicia, for supporting me throughout this very long process. I can't believe I'm finally done with this book. It's been a long journey. So I'm going to try to summarize the main points that I make in the book. I'm going to try to be brief, and then we can talk about it. So the most general points, and shall we go to my, okay.
Yeah. Can I go first?
Oh,
all right. So thank you for that wonderful remark. So indeed, the book presentations are
points that I make in the book. I'm going to try to be brief. And then
because we're currently live streaming, on YouTube. So if you're not available to watch in person, so we are on YouTube. So again, thank you for that remarks. So indeed, presentations are
points that I make in the book. I'm going to try to.
All right. So, again, book presentations are indeed the celebration for these kinds of things. So again, we're encouraging our professors. So if you have some books coming up, and then partner with the library for this book presentation. So before I introduce the author, allow me to give a very simple description of the book. So the late Russian Empire experienced rapid economic change, social dislocation, and multiple humanitarian crises, enduring 2 wars, 2 famines, and 3 revolutions. A pastoral activism took hold on parish clergymen, led and organized the response of Russian Orthodox Christians to these traumatic events. In Russian social gospel, Daniel considers the roles played by pastors in the closing decades of the failing Tsarist Empire and the explosive 1917 revolutions. The book draws upon the extensive research or archival research to examine the effects of the pastoral movement on the Russian society and the Orthodox Church. From the description of the book, we can sense how interesting the book is, given also the remarks from Dr. Siegfried. So it's time for us to get to know the author of the book. Daniel is an associate professor of history at Nazarbayev University. His research interest includes the religious and intellectual history of late imperial Russia and Muslim-Christian relations in 19th century Central Asia. He grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. He studied philosophy as an undergraduate at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, before moving to Russia in 2001 as Peace Corps volunteer. He taught English in Okya. Okay. Yeah, sorry. Lodeno, Paul, and Timur. Daniel returned to Russia in 2007 to conduct archival research in Moscow and Tver as a Fulbright Hays Fellow. In 2012, he earned his PhD in the history of the Russian Empire from Georgetown University, and from 2013 to 2015, he held a fellowship at the Havig-Hearst Center of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. He began teaching here at NU in August of 2015. Friends, a round of applause for Dr. Daniel Scarborough.
Okay, thanks again, April. Okay, so I'll go ahead with my talk. So the most general point that I'm making in this book is that religion is a dynamic force in the modern world. It's not withering away. It's not stagnant. It has adapted to the changes that we see in the world today, and it has contributed to and driven some of those changes. And so in order to understand recent history, in order to understand modern society, we need to understand religion. Specifically, the book examines the parish clergy of the Orthodox Church in the Russian Empire, and I focus on the diocese of Moscow and Tver. And I look at the responses of these clergymen to the problems that beset the Russian Empire over its final decades: poverty, illiteracy, humanitarian crises, famine, war, revolution. And I argue that these clergymen organized effective responses to these problems. They did so in the form of humanitarian relief campaigns, mutual aid organizations, and ultimately political mobilization. And in doing so, I further argue that they influenced what Orthodoxy was at that time, to some extent what it is. They made it a more inclusive, a more participatory church, and they incorporated social engagement, mutual aid, charity, more centrally into the practice of that tradition. Okay, first slide. Next one. Okay, well, we're waiting for that. There we go. So the prevailing image of Orthodoxy in the Russian Empire continues to be influenced by Soviet propaganda. This is the image of a corrupt, parasitic institution preaching political conformity. And it's interesting that I see this perspective echoed in a lot of scholars who are not necessarily sympathetic to the Soviet project. Even some Cold War historians who are hostile to the Soviet Union still manage to echo this image that we get from Soviet propaganda. And of course, there were wealthy clergymen who enjoyed generous state salaries and who did preach political conformity, preached obedience. But those were mostly members of the monastic or black clergy, черное духовенство. Those are the ones who populated the leadership, the episcopate of the church, the bishops, archbishops, and metropolitans. My book focuses on a different group of clergymen, the parish clergy. And if you'd give me the next slide, please. So these were the so-called white clergy, the белое духовенство, those who performed religious services at the level of the parish community. These guys mostly did not receive support from the state. They relied on the voluntary support of their parishioners, who were mostly peasants who didn't have a lot to give. So So a lot of these priests, deacons, sacristans were not much better off than the peasants that they were serving. You find, by the way, a vivid depiction of clerical poverty in the short story by Anton Chekhov called Nightmare, Kashmar. Moreover, unlike the black clergy, unlike the monastic clergy who were celibate, these priests had families. They married, and they often had many children that they had to feed and that they had to educate. How did they do this on such limited resources? They pooled their resources. They put them together and they formed mutual aid societies. And the clergy had some of the most extensive social networks, mutual aid societies in the Russian Empire, stretching from the level of the parish, the remote villages, to the capitals of the diocese, the eparchia. And the diocese in the Russian Empire roughly corresponded with the governorship, the gubernia. This, by the way, is the image that's on the cover of the book. I found it in a museum in the town of Torzhok, a very small museum. I just like this picture. Next slide, please. The children of priests, the adult children, Popovichi and Popovni, the men and the women, were born into this clerical estate, Duchovное сословие. They were expected to grow up and serve the church as their fathers had done, but in order to get a job as a priest or a clergyman, the son of a priest, a Popovich, needed a seminary education. And if he didn't get one, he was likely to be drafted into the military. The daughters of priests, if they did not get married, or if they were widowed, or if they were orphaned, they would be completely impoverished. They would have no way to support themselves. However, if they had an education, they could work as teachers. And so one of these things that these mutual aid societies did was to build schools for girls and to support the seminaries. So these diocesan schools for girls, eparchialные училища, educated these girls known as eparchialki. And these daughters of priests ended up providing a very important source of literacy, of force for the spread of literacy. This is one thing that I look at in the book, in the Russian hinterland, among the peasantry. So these societies, these mutual aid organizations that the clergy built, provided support for impoverished members of the clerical estate and supported this education, which in turn contributed to the general spread of literacy. Next slide, please. Another consequence of the parish clergy's reliance on the voluntary support of parishioners was that they were more concerned with the priorities of the people, of the narod, than they were concerned for the priorities of the state. The state could punish, but it couldn't benefit them too much. If they wanted to be supported by their parishioners, they had to please them. They had to do what they needed. So they were sensitive to their needs. This concern for the needs of the laity, together with their capacity for organization, together with the presence of these mutual aid networks that they had built, made the clergy very good organizers and made them very effective at responding to these humanitarian crises that we mentioned at the beginning, the famines, the wars, and ultimately the revolutions. So, for example, the first famine that I look at is the Great Famine of 1890 to 92. We had in European Russia a series of droughts combined with hard frosts, and the result was that approximately 400,000 people died of starvation and disease by 1892. So this was a great scandal for the regime, for the imperial regime, but it was not the result of an indifference to human life, as we would see in the Soviet period and the artificial famines of the Stalinist era. The problem was not so much indifference as it was a lack of infrastructure and a lack of information. And this is where the clergy were able to help. With their networks, the clergy were able to solicit donations of grain, and money, and also provide information to the central committees of who is starving, where is the relief most urgently needed. And I examine a series of these disaster responses over the course of the book. Okay, next slide, please. Over the final decades of the Russian Empire, I found that the boundary separating mutual aid within the clerical estate and clergy-led mutual aid organizations for everyone else at the parish level, that boundary began to blur. And what I am displaying here is I added up all of the rubles that were spent relying on the reports of the Holy Synod, the governing institution of the church, all of the rubles that were spent by the mutual aid organizations for the clerical estate, and all of the rubles spent by the parish level mutual aid organizations. And what you see is a clear trend. You see a transfer of resources from just the clerical estate to everyone else. And this, what I mean by the pastoral movement, is the effort by the clergy to recruit the participation of the laity in this mutual aid activity, because they needed them to participate so they'd be more willing to contribute to it. But one consequence of that is that the laity ended up taking more control over these resources, taking control over how they were spent. And so one argument that I make in the book is that ultimately the parish clergy increased the capacity of Russian society to organize itself and to solve its own problems, increase the capacity of people to respond to all of the stresses of the modernization process and the poverty and the famines and so forth. Okay, so how does this translate into politics? This is what I examine in the last two chapters of the book. Next slide, please. We cannot make any generalizations about the political sympathies of the parish clergy, mostly because we don't know, but partially because of censorship. There were, of course, very conservative clergymen. There were also radical clergymen. It's one of the latter, of the infamous Father Gapon, who actually organized the first large-scale workers' organization in Russia and led the march on the Winter Palace that was fired on by troops and resulted in Bloody Sunday and set off the 1905 revolution. This resulted in the creation of Russia's first national parliament, and priests were elected to all four of these dumas, the parliaments. The authorities assumed that the priests would be a conservative force in these dumas, but in fact, the first two, that was not the case. All of the clerical deputies who were elected to the first two dumas were left-leaning or radical. So for example, and there weren't that many, there were 6 in the first Duma. All 6 of them supported the abolition of the death penalty. All 6 of them advocated the redistribution of land to poor peasants. And this was not because the priests were all left-leaning. It's because they were elected by clerical voters together with lay voters, and this was the result of the democratic process. These are the people who were chosen. Students of Russian history will know that the Tsar dissolved the first 2 Dumas because of their radical character. After he dissolved the second Duma in 1907, voting laws were rearranged to produce more conservative parliaments. One of these rearrangements was to isolate the clergy into a separate voting curia that could be controlled and manipulated. So here's a quote by the Orthodox philosopher Sergei Bulgakov, and son of a village priest, writing in 1912 about his observation of clerical voting for the 4th Duma. The authorities had assigned them, the clerical voters, to the right-wing bloc beforehand, and they were under the constant observation of the bishop. One must understand how great and unchecked the bishop's power over the clergy is in order to understand the fist that has been raised over the clergy's heads and the agonizing situation they've been put in. To show defiance and cast a secret vote, in quotations, which was in fact observed, was to consciously risk the loss of one's position, i.e. complete ruination. So the clergy were neutralized as an independent political force after 1907, and hand-picked monarchist priests predominated in the last two Dumas. But this unchecked power of the bishop over the parish clergy would be challenged in 1917. And here's my last slide. By the way, in that previous slide, you could see a group of deputies and there was a priest among them. That's why I put that up. The last chapter of my book is called Revolution in the Church. Over the spring and summer of 1917, this institution called the Diocesan Congress, Yeparchialny Syezd, convened in all 67 dioceses of the former Russian Empire. The Tsar is gone by now. This is an institution that was part of that mutual aid network. It was a congress of representatives of the clergy and the laity that would meet to discuss the allocation of relief or educational funds or whatever. This institution took on a political character in 1917. Out of all of those congresses, at least 15 deposed their bishop and elected new ones. And these were the first elections, we could say democratic elections of clergy, of bishops, I should say, in the history of the Russian Church. One of them was the new metropolitan, that's the highest rank of bishop, the new metropolitan of Moscow, Tikhon Belavin. His predecessor had been appointed under the influence of Rasputin. Everyone hated him. So the Congress told him to get lost, and they elected this new guy, Tikhon Belavin. And this is just before the All-Russian Church Council, the Sabor, a very well-known event. Actually, there's one more slide. This major council restored the Russian patriarchate, which had been abolished by Peter the Great in 1721. And it was the same Tikhon Belavin who was elected to become Russia's 11th patriarch at this council or Sabor. I argue in the book that the revolution, the so-called revolution in the church, played a very important role in determining the character of this Sabor. It ensured that it was more inclusive. Some people wanted this to be only a council of bishops, but in fact, clergy and laity were included as voting members. And if they had not asserted themselves politically with these organizations that had been created by the parish clergy in 1917, that probably would not have happened. And it turns out that this reformed church, the most conspicuous reform being the restoration of the patriarch, this reformed church was the only institution of Tsarist Russia to survive the revolution. And one reason for that, I think, is the democratic mandate that it was given by these councils and by these elections. And I'll end it there, and rather abruptly, and maybe we can discuss it. Thank you.
All right, so thank you for sharing your thoughts, Dr. Damien, for your insights about your book. So I'm pretty sure that our participants or our audience have some questions now. Okay, so if you have questions, the mic. Okay, you can move forward. Okay, okay. This one. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so maybe you can tell something about yourself first, and then to acknowledge.
Yep. This is going to be the hardest question I get.
All right.
Yeah, oh my God. Yeah, I will acknowledge myself. Mikhail Akulov, I'm a historian, colleague of and a friend, I hope. Before this question, a friend, who knows, of Daniel Scarborough. So yeah, I would like to say that then thank you very much for, well, for everything. I mean, not that you're responsible for everything, but everything you've done. Thank you for seeing you work this way through. I mean, actually, I've known you since 2018. I remember how you were working in the archives in Almaty. I don't know whether it made its way.
It did a little bit, yeah.
Right. But seeing you work and overcome all those hurdles, the moments of self-doubt, etc., and ultimately arriving at this the product. Your book, makes us all believe that the task is not as daunting as it is. It is daunting, but it's not a hurdle that is insurmountable. So,
thank you.
Right.
I know you're softening me up for your questions. So go ahead.
Well, actually, I must say that I haven't yet read the book I'm looking for, but we have had conversations before about this. And what I like about the book that I haven't yet read is the clarity of your argument. Really, so many books nowadays, when you're being asked, what is the thesis? What is an argument? You start off and you don't know where to go. But here, it's very clear. And what I also like is that it actually goes against the kind of conventional wisdom. And I think you kind of point out to this. So, I guess the question would be, I do appreciate exactly this assertion of yours that the local, clergy, right, the white clergy working in parishes was becoming more actively involved with their parishes and how they were responsible for creating, those civil societies. We're not going to go into this discussion, but you know what I mean. Helping local populations become very organized in promoting their agendas, etc. I like it, and I see the truth to this absolutely. My question is, then, why is this? Given this gradual democratization, right, and of the white clergy, the parishes, why is this that during the revolution and the civil war, we do not see anything in Russia, in the Orthodox part at least of the Russian Empire, that would have been similar to the Vendée in France? But so why is it that we don't see, peasants, not workers, but let's say peasant population mobilized by all those beloved local priests, and instead, very often those peasants would go along with the anti-religious agenda of the revolutionaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one reason for it, and my book doesn't, I don't claim to explain the revolution or how it went, but one misconception is about that period is that everyone was perfectly ready to destroy the churches and execute the priests, and that's absolutely not true. The Russian population is one of the most religiously, the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox, one of the more religiously observant, if you compare it with the rest of Europe at this time. I think one answer to that question is that the violence against the clergy did not always occur right away. I know that we have, I'm reading actually records of what was happening in Verny around Almaty right now, and a lot of these Bolsheviks were Christians, and they actually voted to retain religious education. I don't want to get too much into this, but why did everyone support the Bolsheviks at that time? They were the most radical. They were providing what seemed like solutions to these to the problems of war and starvation. Yes, they were anti-religious, but yeah, again, I don't think that the people who supported them, and that all of the popular support for the Bolsheviks didn't last forever, by the way. I think it was kind of you may disagree with me here, but I think it was a sort of a burst of enthusiasm for this revolutionary solution to the problems. But that's basically my answer. I mean, of course, there was a civil war, and there was the Green Movement, and there was resistance, and And also the Bolsheviks had a strategy of right, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there were priests involved in the white movement, but you don't really see them conspicuously organizing organizing armed resistance. And maybe one reason for that is that the priests were to some extent politically passive. That may be the short answer to that question. They weren't used to violent resistance. Shall I be the one to call on people?
Yeah, there's another one from, yeah, Prostam, can you give it first? There's, okay.
Okay, it's just a very brief commentary, and I'll give it to others. It's like, thank you very much for this talk. It answered for me the question that has bugged me since my Soviet childhood, namely, why so many revolutionaries, anarchists, the kind of people Chernyshevsky wrote about, were priests' sons or perhaps daughters. And I used to explain it to myself that it was just like an adolescent revolt against the values of their parents. But now I'm thinking more like they were probably already used to, continuation, used to the social gospel you're talking about, and they just took it further.
Yeah, there's a whole book on that by Laurie Manchester called Holy Father's Secular Sons. And I kind of touch on that in the book, but I'm of course looking at the seminarians who did not become revolutionaries like Stalin and Chernyshevsky and Dobrolyubov, but those who actually became priests. But there is a very thin line separating them ultimately.
Kind of a related question. When I was listening to your talk, oh, by the way, Gabriel McGuire, Department of Literature. It's really seemed like you're focusing very heavily on structural factors in how the church essentially left these people to fare for themselves, and as a result, they're highly reliant on the parishioners. I'm wondering if there's any kind of discourse or debate that's going along with this, that's providing a theological or intellectual justification or possibly argument against this sort of mutual aid or the positions that they're taking vis-a-vis either the Bolsheviks or the Tsarist state.
Yeah, that's a good question. There was actually a lot of guilt among the clergy and the seminarians. You see that coming out. Like I found one priest is describing this mutual aid society for the clergy, because this was a real problem. You have a priest die, and all of a sudden you have 5 orphans, and you have to do something about that. And so that's why the regime is allowing them to organize on a scale that most other estates or soslovia are not allowed to do, because it's either that or you do something with these people, let the priests take care of them. But the priests are starting to say, how can we ask them for money for our orphans when they have all of these orphans? How can I say to my parishioners, oh, please give me more money? And so that there was this emotional response to the poverty of the people, and so that's part of it. And there are also theological discussions being made. Bible references, faith without works is dead, things like that. But actually, the title of this, I just thought it sounded good, the social gospel. But this is a reference to the movement in the United States, where Walter Rauschenbusch, who is the kind of the theorist of the social gospel movement, begins his book on it by saying, we already have this movement, now we need a theology for it. And I think it's a similar situation here. Yes, it's driven by the Christian tradition, but there was nobody who at the center who said, okay, we need to do this, we need to take better care of the people. It was more of a spontaneous movement among the parish clergy.
Thank you very much, Dan. Vladimir, philosophy. So what I actually also wanted to say what Mikhail said, I really like the clarity of your argument. So as a philosopher, I really appreciated that. As a theologian, I really appreciated the fact that you highlighted very neglected. It's not an aspect of the church. Church is like an organism. So this part of the organism is often completely neglected. And I would really look forward to reading your book. It seems very interesting. Now, I have two questions, actually, very short questions. I was wondering about this Sabor 1917, and you talk about democratic elections. I was like, no, that's not how it's supposed to. How can you tell me more about, because you know, a metropolitan needs to be ordained. It needs to be, we call it hierotonia. So even if the priests vote for someone, there has to be other bishops and metropolitans that are going to ordain this metropolitan as a person. So we still need to keep this functioning of the organism. If you could tell me more about it, because I've never heard of anything similar in Orthodox Christianity. And I also had a question about, so you said that the church is the only, I forgot the word, institution, that tsarist institution that survived. I wouldn't say that it's a tsarist institution. Church existed much before tsarist Russia. But I would also say that it's not like the new government, let's not name them, didn't try to destroy the church. They just used different methods. The same happened in Yugoslavia. So they didn't just cancel it, but they did have various ways of trying to infiltrate the church, or even so you know what I mean. Let's not go into too many detail. So can you please explain to me why you said that it's a tsarist institution, and can you tell me more about this Sabor that I found really interesting? Thank you, and thank you for the book. It's awesome, man.
Yeah, thanks, Vlad. So both of those objections are really good. First of all, I don't use the word democratic in the book because it is not really correct, as you point out. I use the word conciliar and inclusive because it turned out that the voice of the people really did matter. I go into the whole how canon law deals with this in the last chapter of the book. So as you know, the bishop has apostolic authority. The bishop, as a successor of the apostles, is supposed to be the one making these decisions. But we ended up in the situation where people were really fed up with the bishops, who had gotten fat on the support of the state. People were calling them diocesan satraps. So, I mean, not all of them were that bad, but some of them were really tyrannical. And suddenly you have this revolt. What I argue in the last chapter is that the priests ultimately calmed down this revolt because they realized that if we challenge too much apostolic authority, then we have no authority as ordained priests either. And so what you end up with is a compromise. There's a very interesting study, I forget what year, early, like just before this, like 1907 or something, by a church intellectual, Zalziersky, who talks about what form ecclesiastical government should take in Russia. And he says there are different forms. So we need people to be advising the bishops. We can't, he said that number one, the bishops are supposedly, they have absolute authority. But in fact, they don't have that much authority because they don't know what's going on. They can't pay attention to everything. And so these secretaries, these bureaucrats in the church, being controlled ultimately by the state, are the ones wielding the power, and we need to get beyond that. So that's a complex debate. And very briefly, the kind of compromise that is reached is that the bishops basically said, okay, any decision that is made by the laity and by the parish clergy, we can veto because we have apostolic authority, but we're going to listen to it. So, yeah.
If I could just add a finger, I find this to be a perfect example of an Orthodox understanding of church, because for Orthodox Christians, every person is a priest. And what you've actually, this example tells me how an organism adapts to new circumstances
Mhm.
without losing the essence of the organism. So I found this extremely interesting as an example and as a book, man,
Mhm.
really interesting.
Thanks.
Sorry. Now
Yeah.
the second question.
Yeah, the last thing, yeah, so I misspoke. I would say Imperial Russian era institution. I think to call it a czarist institution is a bit provocative and harsh. I agree with you that that's not the right way to put it. And yes, the Soviet regime, what I'm describing in 1917 is not the church, unfortunately, that we have today. And I think that the fact that Tikhon was installed gave the church a figurehead to hold it together through that initial period of persecution, because the Soviet regime did attempt to foment schism in the church by fostering, by supporting this dissident movement of so-called red priests who were basically sold themselves to the regime for power. Ultimately, I don't know, not everyone agrees with me there, but Tikhon was able to hold it together and prevent what the goal was, which is to basically to split it apart. But that's all subsequent history that I won't go into now. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
You just mentioned the Red Priests, and that was actually what I was planning to ask about.
Mm.
Because in the early Soviet period, there was the quote unquote Zhivaya Tserkov,
Mhm.
the Renovationists, and I was wondering how organic the continuity was between the late
Mhm.
imperial social gospel and this radical faction of priests that kept something going from the 20s through the 40s.
Mhm.
Were they active in the Sabor? Were they known, or were they just kind of nobodies who were raised up by the state? Like, in what way
Yeah.
can they be seen as a radicalization
Yeah.
of the late imperial social gospel?
Yeah, I think the latter would be the answer. The priests who became the Renovationists, the Red Priests, were an obscure radical dissident group. There was continuity between them, of course, and some of these other dissident priests who were concerned with incorporating the laity more into the church. But they were more radical. They refused to recognize the legitimacy of Tikhon, of the new patriarch, because they didn't think that the Sabor went far enough. And as you may know, what happened in 1919 is that Vidensky and the other leaders of this movement went up to Zinoviev and said, "Oh, we can be communists and Christians." And Zinoviev said, "Okay." And this movement was sponsored, but the Soviet regime never had any intention of allowing this to become a lasting institution, and they killed all of them. As you probably know, all of these red priests are ultimately executed. I think that some of the guys in the beginning of this movement, Vidensky is actually an interesting person, but I think that he ultimately sold himself to the regime and said what he was expected to say. And some of the other bishops, people who joined the living church, were originally Black Hundredists. They were originally far-right monarchists who now joined a new master. I don't want to make that generalization. They weren't all like that, but I don't have a whole lot of respect for that movement, and yeah, that's my response.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Daniel, as you know, I taught a course on Soviet and post-Soviet religions in the last semester, and of course we covered this period of Orthodox Christianity in late imperial and early Soviet time, and I'm sure that your book now will be actively used within my course. This is something I was really waiting for impatiently, I would say. So my question is about the network system of that you outlined already in your short introduction, that the clergy were active in providing assistance and support to say peasants and probably some townspeople
in need. Now, but at the same time, we know that other alternative networks existed in Russia, in addition to, of course, state organs. There was Zemstva, was very active in doing the same, right? And we know that many, say, Russian politicians, Narodniki, were involved in Zemstva, and too many of them were had a very, I would say, negative attitude towards the church and priests in general. And then later in the revolutionary time, we know that social democrats became even more radical in their assessment of church, role of church in the Russian history and Russian life. So my question is, if on the level of parishes, clergy are so sensitive to the people's needs, to the peasants' needs, where this negative attitude to priests come from? Not necessarily among the intellectuals, right? Like Russian populists, but even in the among the masses of people, right? Am I wrong or in this assessment, or maybe this is again one of the artifacts of this Soviet propaganda, or probably something was wrong with this network?
No, I think everything that you said is correct. There was anti-clericalism, certainly, and one reason for that is because people had to support these priests, and the priests were always putting their hand out. You know, you need me to bury somebody. You need me to perform a wedding. You need me to do whatever. Every single time they're putting out their hand. And so people got sick of that, obviously. And what the priests were saying was that people don't respect us. We need the state to pay us, like they do in France, like they do in most of Europe with the official church. But that never materialized. That never happened. It did in provinces where there was a significant Catholic or Muslim influence. The state would then support the clergy to give them an edge. But in the central Western Russia, the areas I'm looking at, no. And so there's some anti-clericalism coming out of there. But what the priests ultimately say is, you know, we have to be better. We have to be more helpful. So that's I think some of that tension was productive in spurring them onward to organize relief and charity and so forth. Also, in terms of the other organizations that you mentioned, this is one point I also make in the book, is that late imperial Russia was rich in voluntary institutions. It had the largest cooperative movement in Europe at the time. And so this idea that, you know, the famous saying by Antonio Gramsci that civil society in Russia is, what is it, gelatinous and primitive or something. It's not true. What the clergy did enjoy was the toleration of the state, because the state thought that they were on their side. The state is always harassing. It simultaneously wants society to organize and take care of itself and solve problems. But the minute anyone steps out of line, they shut it down. And this is what happened famously in the relief efforts in World War I, to almost like suicide of the regime. And so one consequence of that, I talk about this in my chapter on the famine, is that the Zemstva were not allowed to communicate with one another across the boundary of the gubernia. They could only do so through the governors. They had to go through this bureaucracy, and the governors were obstructionists in some cases, like, oh, why do you need to talk to Tver? You know, we have enough. But whereas the church could talk across dioceses. So this is one thing that made the clerical networks effective, is that they were more in favor. They were more tolerated by the regime.
Hello. Hey, Dan, thank you so much for your book talk. I'm Brian Smith from the Political Science Department. I'm really interested in your use of the term mutual aid. To what extent is this a descriptive category? You know, were they self-consciously evoking this language of the anarchist tradition? or were they actually theoretically building, their own variant of this, right? So, to what extent were they actively building it versus is this just a descriptive category that you're, using to characterize these behaviors?
It's actually a direct translation of the term that they were using, взаимная помощь, and they certainly were not thinking of Bakunin or anyone when they used the word. I think that this is something that is deeply ingrained in that society. You have the peasant communes and the soslovia system. Allison Smith has written a very good book on the estate system. What's it called? For the common, I forget. Anyway, yeah, it's a great book about how this soslovia system of collective responsibility evolved into mutual aid out of necessity. So yeah, I mean, we should talk more about that actually at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned that daughters of priests, popes, participated in literate movement, but in accordance with official statistics of Tsar Russia, most literate population was in industrial areas and Baltic regions. In rural areas, usually very illiterate. So it's a significant fact or not to characterize, I don't know, progressive character of priests or not. In my opinion, it's just, of course, we also can say that daughters of Lev Tolstoy participated in creating, people schools, but it's only just a fact, not some tendency or significant movement. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think the fact that the hinterland was so illiterate increased the importance of the clergy, because very often they were the only literate people around, and they were under intense pressure, as I tried to explain, to be literate, because that was the way to actually survive, especially in the late 19th century. If you end up being a clerical widow, I found these letters to the bishop saying, you got to help me, give me a job baking communion bread somewhere, because otherwise I'm going to starve. But if they had an education, they could teach in these parish schools as well as zemstva schools, and many of them did. Yeah. So you're asking how significant of a force they were. I think, yeah, also, I remember what I was going to say. What you see in the late 19th century is that literacy becomes more in demand. Earlier in the century, the peasants really didn't care that much about learning to read. A lot of the priests were being told, oh, set up a parish school. And they would say, narod не хочет, that nobody wants it. But later on, you could get a job at the railway station, at the post office. There was work available that required literacy. So the demand for literacy increased, and that in turn increased the incentive for these for members of the clerical estate to make use of this educational system that they had built. And then you get the zemstva schools start building up centers of literacy at the level of the uyezd. And what I say in the book is that these daughters of priests become important as a source of literacy for peasant girls in the more remote areas. Because if you're a peasant family, maybe you'll send your son to the uyezd center, maybe teach this, he doesn't work very well, teach him how to read, maybe he'll do something. You're not going to send your daughter there. But there were these yeparchialki were available at the parish level, at the village level. And so I found some evidence for that. So I think that actually a book needs to be written on these women and the contribution they made to the spread of literacy.
Is another one? Yep.
Good afternoon, Professor. Good afternoon, everyone. As just a student, I wanted to ask about the way you conducted your research. Your book is heavily based on the archival work, and I wanted to ask what obstacles did you face when doing this archival work, and what scholars should watch out for when they start their research? Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for that question. First of all, when I was this book is partially based on my dissertation. When I was doing my my research for my dissertation, lo and behold, the Russian Federation decided to close the main archive for the Russian Empire, which is in St. Petersburg. That turned out to be a blessing because it forced me to work in local archives. So I worked in the local archives of Tver and Moscow, and I found things that I never would have if I had relied only on that central archive. So then I did go back and work in the central archive Ergia in St. Petersburg and add to this research to produce the book. But I guess one answer to your question is look for opportunities in obstacles that arise. Yeah.
Okay, any
Congratulations
questions?
on your book.
There is, okay, yeah.
Congratulations again on your book.
Thank you.
You said that their resources were limited, and because of it, they created this mutual aid. I'm wondering how they survived during the famine.
Mhm.
Did you explain it
Yeah.
in the book? Thank you.
Yeah. In the really famine affected areas, the priests were suffering. I found some accounts of this where they were saying the priest would show up at the soup kitchen that he had organized, and then he would say, "Can my children please eat here too?" This was compounded by the fact that clergy were not allowed to work, technically. They were allowed to teach, and they were allowed to perform religious services, and they were allowed to farm. So they had their land that they could farm. But so yeah, the short answer is that they did suffer. And one of my chapters, I look at actually the dilemma of where to send the aid. So Moscow was wealthier, obviously. Moscow was sending aid to different dioceses, and then you get the letters back from these dioceses, and some of them are telling them, okay, we gave this relief money to these clerical families. These are the priests and deacons who are hungry, and we've taken care of them with this relief. And in other dioceses, they're saying we're helping these people who are living in the street. So there's the shifting motivations of the clergy and the shifting decisions that they made about how to understand charity and mutual aid was very interesting. I look at Tver and Moscow in my book, which were the most actively engaged in transferring that wealth, those resources to help the general population. There were other parts of the empire where it stayed pretty much among the clergy. So I'm, in some sense, I'm presenting a bit of a rosy picture of this pastoral movement because I'm focusing on very proactive areas of the empire. Yeah, thanks.
There we go. Thanks, Stan. I'm excited to see this book in print as well because I've been around since the very beginning of the book. So I have a question. It maybe anticipates actually what you're doing now, your future research, but one intriguing thing you said was that in the non-Russian regions, the non-Orthodox regions, the priests were actually paid a salary. And so the immediate question is, do we see, or do you think you see less of this mutual aid and more of a kind of just clerk or cleric as bureaucrat kind of mentality? So I'm wondering if there's a connection there.
Yeah, thanks. So I think you see similar efforts to care for the population in border regions, but for different reasons. The Orthodox Church was very paranoid about the successes of other confessions at taking care of their own people. They would say, look, the old believers are taking care of their poor. Why aren't we? The old believer village looks better than our village. That's a problem. And they're sort of spurring on the clergy. And what I'm reading right now, my research right now is Turkestan. And there's this constant paranoia that everyone's going to convert to Islam because a few Cossacks be like, look, I'm hungry. I've fallen on hard times and I've gotten no help from the church, but I found refuge in this aul, and these people are caring for me. I've adopted Islam. And then this is a huge story in the diocesan press, even though it doesn't happen that often. And so the authorities are saying, we have got to set up some charities quick, or they'll be like, there's this Tatar who's gotten this charity going in Verni. What a disaster. How do we stop this? And it's a really unfortunate, obviously, because it built on antagonism between the different confessions, and it prevented cooperation. And what I argue in another thing that I wrote in an edited volume is that we see the beginnings of cooperation. We see old believers and Jews, at least, participating and benefiting from some of these mutual aid societies, but the state basically sabotaged it like they did so much. Yeah.
So in Belgium, in the 20th century Belgium, one of the common sense ideas that I grew up with was that the Catholic Church was actually driven to provide more mutual aid because of competition with the socialist or social democrat movement. So something vaguely similar there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that in Pope Leo's Rerum Novarum in 1871. He kind of says that. He says that, look, all of this concern for the workers, this is a Christian thing. It's not a socialist thing, and that we have to be able to basically I bless the organization of the workers. So you see that, and you also see Kuiper and where was he giving this speech? Maybe Amsterdam, talking about Christian socialism as well. So what I'm describing happening in Russia has analogs all over the world around this time in response to religious responses to industrialization and the social changes that we see in the 19th century.
Okay, I think just one more question.
Hi, I'm Joseph Anderson. I'm in the Eurasian Studies Masters. I was kind of curious about, I know this is a bit earlier than the period you're talking about, but how much of like Christian peasant movements like the Dukhobors like kind of contributed to this reaction from the church to be more involved in the community of the peasants? Yeah, that's kind of my general question.
Yeah, that is kind of connected with what I was saying in response to Curtis's comment there. Yeah, the old believers were very effective at they were more effective in many cases at taking care of their own. And part of the reason for that is that they were an insular community and they were persecuted. And so they kind of stuck together. And yeah, again, the authorities would say that we need to stop looking bad in comparison to the old believers. I don't know so much about the Dukhobors, but there's a whole report by this guy Melnikov on the old believers of Nizhny Novgorod, where he says something similar, that these deceitful old believers will give money to public institutions so that we will think they're nice people. Like there's this idea that their charitable contributions are somehow dishonest, and that it's embarrassing that they're doing this and our people are not. So yeah, exactly. This was also a stimulus to the Orthodox pastoral movement.
Okay, so thank you so much for those questions. I understand that you have so many questions that are coming in, but just to promote, we have the book already. So we have one. This is an autograph book. So we are kind of ordering more, hopefully, in the coming days. But this will be available by next week. So hopefully you can borrow the book. So I think it's time for us to ask for some parting words from our speaker or from our author. So any words before we formally end this event?
I'll
Yeah.
just say I'm really touched that all of you guys came to hear this, especially those of you who've been hearing about it for so long now. So I really enjoyed answering your questions, and thank you for coming.
Okay, so that's very short. So again, thank you to our author and to our participants who have joined us. Closing remarks.
First of all, I would like to introduce to you new library director, General Kavana, and also new senior expert, Monica Bukovska. As well as the book itself, I would like to express our librarians' great gratitude to the author of the book, and also staff of School of Sciences and Humanities, because Professor Scarborough renew our tradition to conduct book presentation at the library. And we are very grateful for cooperation and popularization of books written by researchers and teachers of Nazarbayev University. So I would like to wish Professor Scarborough good health, inspiration, and new, interesting, and very on demand, high demand by readers of books. And also I how to say, congratulate you on the new academic year and wish you good health and success in your teaching, research. So good luck. Thank you for attention.
Please, thank you, Piotr. And I think that ends our event today. Our profound gratitude to the authors and to the participants who have attended the in-person and online event. So you can watch the recording of the event in our YouTube channel. And again, we hope to see you on our next events. This has been April, your moderator. Thank you and have a great day. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Can I ask for a photo op?